All right, so today we're diving into a case that never seems to go away, the Menendez brothers.
It's a fascinating one for sure.
It is. You probably remember all the headlines, but there's this new Netflix documentary, and oh man, it adds so much to this story.
It does. It's called The Menendez Brothers, and it features interviews with Lyle and Erik, like from prison
Wow.
years later, and we hear from family members, jurors, even Pam Bozanich, the original prosecutor. So many perspectives.
It's wild. Like, we're going way beyond just rehashing the murders of Jose and Kitty Menendez in 1989.
Right.
The trials, the whole abuse defense, and the life sentences. This doc really gets into like what the brothers are thinking now, how they're living in prison. Makes
Hmm.
you wonder, if the world is looking at this case differently than back then.
It does. One of the things that really stands out to me is how they reflect on their actions.
Yeah.
After all this time in the interviews, they kind of paint this picture of like fear and desperation
Yeah.
in the days leading up to that night.
Yeah. Like when Erik talks about his dreams of going to Stanford. Almost like it was his way out, a chance to escape what he says was happening at home.
Totally.
But then his father basically crushed that dream. He made him stay home, go to UCLA instead. And Erik says he felt totally devastated,
Yeah.
even suicidal. And that's when he told Lyle that the abuse was still going on.
And that's where Lyle's account is really important. He describes confronting their father and realizing that their mother, Kitty, knew all along.
Wow.
They both claimed they were absolutely convinced that their parents were going to kill them.
That's
They were living in constant fear.
that's a really disturbing thought. To
Yeah.
think that they truly believed their lives were in danger. And it really makes you question that whole carefree spending spree narrative that the prosecution push.
Right.
Because that's not the emotional state they describe after the murders at all.
Not at all. Lyle talks about being consumed by guilt, sobbing at night, not being able to sleep,
Oh,
feeling lost without his father's control. It's like a really messed up dynamic, but it was all he knew.
yeah.
And Erik, he expresses this really deep longing for his mother, wishing he could talk to her.
It is. It's
Makes you
really.
think twice about that cold-blooded killer image, doesn't it?
It really does. It feels so much more complex than what we saw, during the trials. Like
Yeah.
we're getting a glimpse into their internal struggles.
Absolutely. And that complexity extends to their lives in prison, too, when they were first sent to different prisons. Lyle described it as tremendously painful. Erik actually went on a hunger strike to try to get them back together.
I mean, that speaks volumes about their bond,
Yeah.
even after everything that happened.
It really does. And it's interesting to see how each brother has kind of coped with prison life. Lyle has taken on this sort of father confessor role for other inmates who've experienced abuse.
Really, I wouldn't have expected that.
And Erik has found solace in art. He paints for hours every day. Describes it as a kind of therapy, a way to connect with something bigger than himself.
It's interesting that Erik has turned to art. Do you think this is like genuine expression for him, a way to process trauma, or could it even be a way to try to find some sort of redemption
That's a great question.
in the public eye?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to how we understand him.
For sure. But we can't just focus on the brothers' perspective here.
Right.
The documentary also features Pam Bozanich, the original prosecutor, and she is not backing down at all
No.
on her stance that the abuse defense was completely fabricated.
Right. And she does not mince words,
Yeah.
calling them poisonous potted plants and maintaining that she's absolutely committed to honoring Kitty Menendez's memory.
It's a powerful counterpoint to the brothers' narrative. It reminds us that we're dealing with multiple, often conflicting truths here. And it makes me think about Pam Bozanich's role in all of this. While some may see her stance as harsh, it's important to consider her position. She was advocating for Kitty Menendez. How do you think her perspective reflects the challenges of seeking justice for victims?
That's such an insightful observation.
Especially when you have these really complex narratives of abuse involved.
Yeah. You're right. Her role isn't just about prosecuting a case. It's about representing a victim who can no longer speak for themselves.
Right.
And that adds a whole other layer of weight to her perspective.
Absolutely. And then you've got this whole other element to consider how the cultural landscape has shifted since the trials.
Yeah.
I mean, the hashtag #MeToo movement and the growing awareness of childhood sexual abuse have definitely changed how people are looking at this case.
Speaking of shifting perceptions, the Me Too movement has undeniably impacted how we view cases like this, especially those involving allegations of sexual abuse back when the Menendez brothers were tried. These issues were rarely discussed openly, particularly when it came to abuse against boys.
You're right. Society's understanding of these issues has come a long way. Since then, we have a much better grasp now of the lasting psychological effects of abuse and the various ways survivors might react.
Makes you wonder how a jury today might view the brothers' claims, considering like our increased understanding of trauma and its complexities.
Back then, it was a very different time.
Totally. And don't forget, social media platforms like TikTok have brought this case back into the spotlight.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And you see a lot of people expressing sympathy for the brothers.
It's interesting.
That's where we see a real generational divide.
Yeah.
Pam Bozanich and Leslie Abramson, Erik's original lawyer, they kind of brushed off these online petitions.
Right.
But you can't deny the power and influence those movements can have.
It's fascinating to watch these different viewpoints clash.
It is.
It reflects like a bigger conversation we're having as a society about how we understand and respond to these kinds of cases.
Totally.
It really makes you think.
It does. And speaking of different viewpoints, one of the most insightful parts of the documentary for me was hearing from the jurors
Oh, yeah.
who served on the trials.
Absolutely.
They had a whole other dimension to the story.
Hearing their reflections after all these years is so valuable.
For example, some of them said they regretted not being able to fully consider the abuse defense.
Right.
Remember, the judge in the second trial actually restricted a lot of that testimony.
That's right. Which makes you question the fairness of the whole legal process.
Yeah.
Did the brothers really get a fair chance to present their full defense?
It's a valid question. And then other jurors talked about the heavy emotional toll of being part of such a high-profile, emotionally charged case.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that jurors are real people wrestling with incredibly difficult decisions that have huge consequences.
It really humanizes the whole process. It makes you wonder how things might have gone differently if they'd been allowed to consider all the evidence, or if the case had been tried in a different era with a different social climate.
It's impossible to know for sure, but those questions are definitely worth considering.
For sure.
And that leads to a broader point. The documentary touches on the evolving nature of how we understand abuse and trauma.
Back in the early 90s, it wasn't like it is now talking about childhood sexual abuse,
Right.
especially when it involved boys.
Yeah.
It was so taboo, it just wasn't something people were comfortable addressing.
Exactly. Society's understanding of these issues has advanced so much since the Menendez trials. We're more aware of the long-term psychological impacts, the complex ways survivors may respond,
Right.
and the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all reaction to trauma.
Which makes you think, how would a jury today view the brothers' claims, knowing what we know now about trauma? Would they see their actions differently?
It's fascinating to think about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Would a modern jury be more open to the abuse defense? Would they be more likely to understand the complexities of their actions?
Right.
Obviously, it's all hypothetical, but it shows how much social norms and understanding can shape how we perceive and judge these cases.
And it emphasizes how important it is to keep revisiting past cases
Yes.
with new knowledge and evolving social perspectives.
Absolutely. It's not about rewriting history, but understanding it in a more nuanced and informed way sometimes. That re-examination can lead to a reassessment of guilt, innocence, or even appropriate punishment.
Which brings us to the fact that the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office is actually reviewing the Menendez case right now.
I was just going to say that.
This is based on new evidence that's come to light since the trials, including allegations of even more abuse by their father, Jose Menendez. Could this actually lead to, like, a reduced sentence for the brothers or even a new trial?
It's certainly a possibility of the DA's reviews taking all this new information into account. And it just goes to show that the legal system, however imperfect it may be, can adapt and reevaluate past decisions.
It gives you hope that justice can prevail even decades later.
Yeah.
But amidst all the complexities and controversies of this case, we can't forget about the victims, Jose and Kitty Menendez. Their lives were tragically cut short, and no amount of re-examination or debate can change that.
You're right. It's crucial to remember that 2 lives were lost.
Yeah.
And those losses are at the heart of this entire story.
Their story and the ripple effects of their deaths are woven into every aspect of this case.
And the documentary doesn't shy away from that. It explores those ripple effects, the impact on family members, friends, and even the community as a whole.
It makes you think about the long-lasting consequences of violence and how they reach far beyond the immediate victims.
Exactly. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about loss, grief trauma, and the enduring search for justice and understanding.
It definitely makes you think about how those things intersect and how difficult it can be to untangle them even years later.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff, no doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we do these deep dives, right?
Totally.
To really try to unpack these complicated stories and, like, make sense of it all.
The Menendez case is such a good example of how complicated these stories can get. It's about family dynamics, abuse the legal system, media influence, and how society's understanding of all of these things can change so much. Yeah, it's like this case has become a cultural touchstone almost, reflecting all these different parts of who we are as a society.
Mhm.
And it's still evolving with the DA's review, potentially changing the outcome of this whole thing.
Right. It's a powerful reminder that justice isn't always like a straight line.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes decades for the truth to really surface and for accountability to happen.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with?
Well, I think it's so important to remember that even in the most like sensationalized cases, there are human beings at the center dealing with really complex emotions and experiences.
Right.
The Menendez brothers, despite the horrific crime they committed, have presented a narrative of fear and desperation stemming from what they claim was years of abuse.
And while the prosecutor remains unconvinced, the evolving social climate and this new evidence have really forced a re-examination of the case.
Yeah, this deep dive has shown us that understanding a case like this means looking at it from multiple perspectives, being open to new information, and recognizing that our understanding of issues like abuse and trauma can grow and evolve over time.
It's like we're constantly learning and reevaluating both as individuals and as a society.
Absolutely. There's no easy answer in this
Yeah.
case. It's up to each person to weigh the evidence, consider the different sides, and form their own conclusions.
So to our listener, now that you've gone deeper into the Menendez brothers' story, heard their accounts, the prosecutor's perspective, and you understand how the social context has changed, what are your thoughts? Has your perspective shifted at all?
We always encourage you to keep exploring. Read the court transcripts, watch the documentaries, do your own research, on the legal arguments, form your own opinions based on what you discover.
Because this case, like so many others, reminds us that justice is an ongoing process, one that demands we stay informed, engaged, and open to new understanding. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.